Hello and welcome back after a little break to my YouTube channel. I'm Harry De Cosmo, freelance football journalist for BBC Sport and others, and I'm here again to look at all things Newcastle United. Obviously there's not been much happening, so I took the opportunity to take a little break from videos, but thank you so much for everyone who subscribed. I have reached over 100 subscribers now, 102 at the moment, so really pleased with that. Please do continue to like, share and subscribe if you like what you hear, and there'll be much more coming up. We're going to look at Saturday's game against Brentford for Newcastle United. Really interesting and also crucial game for Eddie Howe's men as they return to Premier League action after that break. It's not been a good start to the season, obviously, after that huge victory over Aston Villa, the defeat at Manchester City, which was obviously very disappointing. The low point of that Liverpool game, obviously everyone knows what happened there, and then the disastrous result of Brighton. I think that every single game of those has not been there's been something to be disappointed about from Newcastle's perspective, and that puts a little bit of pressure on the game against Brentford. That was always going to be the case. I think if you looked at the fixtures, the difficult start with Villa included, and obviously I don't think anyone expected a 5-1 victory there. With those games, Manchester City, Liverpool, nobody really expected Liverpool to be as sluggish as they were out of the blocks last season. I think they've looked refreshed, and they look like they could be in the picture for the title at the early stages, let alone the top four. So that was always going to be a very tough start. And then Brighton are obviously the team of the moment in England. So Newcastle were always going to have a difficult time of it. They haven't responded well, though. There's been some issues that we'll get into that they need to iron out if they're going to get a result against Brentford. But that's unfortunately where Newcastle stand. They now have to beat Brentford to get their season back on track. And it's all well and good saying that the fixtures are going to get kinder, because they are on paper, and Newcastle have Brentford, then they have Burnley at home after Sheffield United away, and then there's Crystal Palace and West Ham, Wolves between now and the end of October. And that's on paper, a really good opportunity to get right back into the top four race. But then you've got to factor in the Champions League games. Newcastle are at the San Siro on Tuesday. I'll be back before that game to look ahead at that. And then you've got PSG at home on the 4th of October, and then Dortmund at home as well. So that's going to have an impact on these games. And Newcastle have, for the first time, Eddie Howe will go into this game knowing that he has to maybe make some changes ahead of that game at AC Milan, because the way that the group has fallen, 2 home games by the halfway point, if Newcastle are going to get through this group, they really need to start fast. So there's going to be a lot of pressure off the backdrop of some perceived easier fixtures in the league. They've got to make it count in the Champions League as well, because there won't be, if they've got any hope, I think, of getting through this group, because obviously it's very difficult. They've got to win their home games, and 2 of those being in the first half of the campaign makes a huge difference to that. So they've got to hit the ground running. But it all starts with Saturday against Brentford. This is a great opportunity for Newcastle, and I know that's been a sort of feature of every game. We've looked at ahead and said it's a great opportunity, and back and said it's an opportunity missed so far. So they've got to make this one count. But if you look at the history books, Newcastle last year, 5-1 victors against Brentford in a sort of similar point to the season, where Newcastle were drawing games, not losing them, but they were sort of waiting for that moment where everything clicked, and then Brentford came to St James's Park, took the lead, had a goal disallowed, and then it was a little bit of a sluggish start. But then once Newcastle found their groove, Bruno Guimaraes found his groove. He was fantastic that day with 2 goals. Newcastle blew Brentford away. Brentford are without Ivan Toney, obviously, as well. So on paper, this should be a game where Newcastle have to target. But as I mentioned at the start of the video, there's a lot of issues that need to be ironed out, and particularly in midfield. Obviously, we've discussed it on this channel before, and plenty of people have discussed it outside as well, about how that midfield gels. I personally believe Newcastle can still play Bruno Guimaraes at the base of that midfield, and Tonali can fit next to him, and Joe Linton eventually can work. But at the moment, it's just not quite clicking. There are obviously a lot of discussions over whether Sandro Tonali will be fit for this game, and the possible return to AC Milan on Tuesday because of an injury picked up on international duty with Italy. Joe Linton has not been fit. I think he's hobbled through a few games. I think he might need to admit to himself, and people might need to sort of take him out the firing line a little bit, because he hasn't looked fit. And then obviously Bruno's got to pick his form up as well. There are some positive signs on a new contract for Bruno. That's all very close now. It looks like it was always likely to happen. Newcastle made it a priority throughout the summer, but there was a sort of little standoff between the situation with the wages. Newcastle, he's already, I think, the top earner, possibly, or at least one of them. And Newcastle are in a position where they don't want to break the wage structure, but they're going to have to if they're going to keep a player like Bruno happy for a long time. There is a lot of talk of a release clause in there, and a lot of talk that potentially the wanting to play higher up the pitch is an issue that led to the delay in this. But I think it's more to do with the sort of financial situation. Equally, I think he does prefer to play in a number 8 position, and there is a lot of talk that you can't ignore. Did Newcastle make the right decision by not getting a number 6 in? And that's nothing to do with Tonali. He's settled in very well. He's looked good, and he looks the part, and he obviously will step up, because he is of that Champions League level. He's at the level of player that Newcastle need to be signing if they're going to compete at the same level that they are at now. But it's going to take a bit of time, and Newcastle have missed Sean Longstaff, as mentioned before. He might come in on Saturday and play in that midfield, potentially as a replacement for Tonali, potentially as a replacement for Joelinton. But there is a little bit of a sort of sparseness about that midfield if Joelinton isn't fit enough to play. If Tonali isn't fit enough to play, obviously Longstaff himself has had injury problems. He's not looked match fit, and he's the type of player, I think, that needs to be match fit and needs to be at his best and needs to have a run of games to be as effective as he was last season. Obviously, he was almost the unsung hero of that team. I think he, on paper, was the easiest one to take out. I think that's what Eddie Howe has trialled this season. But he was missing towards the end of last season at times, and you could really see. So if he comes back in, and if he plays well, then it might make Eddie Howe have a little rethink about the situation in midfield generally. The crucial thing, I think, in that game last year was that Bruno was able to find those spaces in the more advanced role. The good thing about Longstaff coming in, if he does, is that the midfield is much more fluid and much more, Longstaff does fill in those gaps when Bruno goes forward. So it isn't a case of Bruno just sitting at the base of the midfield all the time, as he has been with Tonali more in those games against Manchester City, Liverpool and Brighton. And therefore that's allowed the other teams to target him and pressure and pull him out a little bit and get in behind him. And I think that's kind of been the situation. I wrote a piece on Bruno this week for colossusbets.com, and I think the key point I was making is that he can still work as a number 6, but you've got to unlock him. You've got to find the right balance for him to unlock Newcastle's form this season. He is absolutely crucial still, even though Tonali has come in, and even though the attention has maybe shifted away from him a little bit, he still remains the Newcastle's most important player from an attacking perspective, because he sets the tone. There's a really good stat from last season that popped up online. I think it was credited to The Athletic, where it basically showed how crucial Bruno is, how impressive Bruno has been at the number 6 role. He's played the second most, last season he played the second most passes under pressure, which was defined as a pass with a player less than 2 metres away from him, with 83% success rate. Only Rodri was better at that. So that proves that Bruno, despite maybe not wanting to be in the 6th role, despite preferring to play higher up the pitch, that he can do it. And he has the ability and the quality in possession. He's usually very press resistant. He's incredibly energetic and technical. That it makes Newcastle so good, makes Newcastle particularly in home games and particularly with fast starts. Brentford have been okay this season. I watched them against Crystal Palace at home the other week, and they were they lacked a lot of quality up front. Obviously that stands to reason without Ivan Toney in attack. He's obviously going to be missing till January because of his ban. But they haven't got that focal point. What they do have, though, is a lot of pace up front, a lot of energy and a lot of interplay, which might make them a threat on the counter-attack, especially if Sven Botman isn't there. Obviously, he's recovering as well, so there's a lot of unknowns from a Newcastle perspective with the team sheet. But I don't think Brentford have got a lot of quality in attack when they miss Toney. I don't think Mbeumo is a player who's going to score a lot of goals for them. Obviously, they might have that focal point with Neil Maupay signing on deadline day for them, re-signing from Everton. That might give them a more familiar look to their style in terms of Maupay doing the sort of physical job that Toney has, that they've lacked without Toney being there. And I think that Newcastle will have to be wary of that, but potentially that might suit them better if because I think that Botman and Byrne, whoever it is at the back, will be more suited to a physical battle than they will, the interplay that Kevin Schade and Brian Mbeumo are quite good at. That they just don't have that sort of clinical nature that Ivan Toney does. So I think that Brentford will pose a lot of threats, but they're not a team that Newcastle should fear. This is a really important game for Newcastle now because of the difficult start to the season. And if Bruno Guimaraes can find anywhere near that form that he showed in this game last October, 5-1 victory, 2 goals, just ran the show completely, particularly in the second half. As the game opened up, he was the killer in that game. And I think this is the kind of thing that Bruno needs to show in this game if Newcastle are to win the game and go into that trip to AC Milan and the San Siro and everything that brings. Is a lot of emotion, a lot of sort of enjoyment about that. But there is a game to play there, and Newcastle will need to get a good result in it. So, the serious business starts now. Newcastle don't have the excuse of difficult opponents on paper, of the games that Newcastle would have lost anyway. That's been the talk a lot of, last season, that they were only a point behind what they got from the equivalent fixtures in last season. Even despite how good it was and how they finished fourth, they didn't do very well against Brighton away. They drew that game. They lost at Liverpool at home, and they lost to Manchester City away. Anyway, Isak will play up front again. I think he came through the Sweden fixtures quite well. Obviously scored a goal. Callum Wilson obviously didn't play very much for England, but came through as well. He'll be another option. Almiron was a little bit of a talk of a niggle with Paraguay. Will he be fit? Probably. I think he should be. They need to start fast, and I think they will. And I think that if they can get an early goal and get St James's Park going back on the back again and get it back to what it was last season, there's a real opportunity to kickstart the season ahead of what